Thunder crackled across the darkening sky as Sarah hurried to bring in her potted plants from the front porch. The weather forecast had warned about the approaching storm, but she hadn't expected it to arrive so suddenly. The wind whipped through the trees, sending leaves spiraling through the air as the first heavy drops of rain began to fall. That's when she saw him, a lone figure struggling against the wind, clutching what looked like a briefcase over his head in a futile attempt to stay dry. He was wearing a soaked business suit, clearly caught unprepared by the sudden downpour. Sarah hesitated for just a moment, her grandmother's voice echoing in her head. Sometimes the greatest blessings come from helping strangers. "Hey," she called out, raising her voice above the howling wind. "You need to get out of this storm." The man turned, revealing a face etched with both relief and uncertainty. He was middle-aged, with graying temples and kind eyes that seemed somehow familiar, though Sarah was certain they'd never met. Living alone in her grandmother's old house on the outskirts of town, Sarah had learned to be cautious. But something about this moment felt different. Perhaps it was the way he stood there, looking more lost than threatening. Or maybe it was just her grandmother's influence still guiding her actions after all these years. "Please come inside," she insisted, gesturing toward her porch. "This storm's only going to get worse." After another moment's hesitation, he nodded gratefully and hurried up her walkway. As they stepped into the warm light of her living room, Sarah noticed how his hands trembled slightly as he set down his briefcase, not from cold, but from something else entirely. "I'm Sarah," she said, handing him a clean towel from the hallway closet. "Let me make you some hot tea while we wait out the storm." He accepted the towel with a wan smile, introducing himself as Richard Thompson. There was something in the way he glanced around her living room, his eyes lingering on the old family photos on the mantel, that made Sarah's instincts prickle. As she moved to the kitchen to prepare the tea, she caught him staring intently at a particular photograph, one of her grandmother standing proudly in front of this very house the day she bought it, back in 1963. Richard's expression was unreadable, but his knuckles were white where they gripped the towel. Over the whistle of the kettle, Sarah heard him clear his throat. "This house," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "how long has it been in your family?" There was something about the way he asked the question that made Sarah pause, tea bags suspended in midair. The storm outside seemed to grow quieter, as if nature itself was holding its breath. "My grandmother bought it," Sarah replied carefully, studying his reaction. "She was one of the first black homeowners in this neighborhood." Richard's face paled slightly, and he reached for his briefcase with trembling fingers. "There's something you need to see," he whispered, pulling out a yellowed envelope. "Something about this house, and your grandmother, that I've carried with me for 40 years. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the room in stark white for a brief moment, and Sarah saw tears beginning to form in Richard's eyes. As he slowly opened the envelope, Sarah felt the weight of decades of untold stories pressing in around them. Whatever secret this stranger carried, she realized her simple act of kindness during a storm was about to uncover a truth that would change everything she thought she knew about her family's history. The rain drummed steadily on the roof above them, creating a rhythmic backdrop to this unexpected moment. Sarah's heart pounded as she watched Richard's hands shake while retrieving what looked like old documents from the envelope. Sometimes the biggest storms in our lives, she would later reflect, aren't the ones that come with thunder and lightning, but the ones that arrive in the form of unexpected visitors bearing long-buried truths. Richard's hands smoothed out the yellowed papers on Sarah's coffee table, the storm still raging outside providing an eerily appropriate backdrop. The documents appeared to be old property records, but what caught Sarah's eye was a handwritten letter dated 1963, the same year her grandmother had purchased the house. "Your grandmother, Rose, wasn't just one of the first black homeowners in this neighborhood," Richard began, his voice barely above a whisper. "She was also one of the bravest people I've ever known, though I was too young to understand it at the time." He paused, running his fingers over the faded handwriting. "My father was the real estate agent who sold her this house." Sarah leaned forward, her tea forgotten. She'd heard stories about how difficult it had been for her grandmother to buy the house, but Rose had never gone into detail, always changing the subject with a sad smile when asked. Now, sitting across from this stranger who seemed to know more about her family's history than she did, Sarah felt her chest tighten with anticipation. Back then, Richard continued, this neighborhood had restrictions, unofficial ones that kept certain families out. My father was one of the few agents willing to break those unwritten rules, but it came at a terrible price. Lightning flashed outside, casting dramatic shadows across Richard's troubled face. He and your grandmother had to conduct their business in secret, meeting late at night in different locations to avoid suspicion. Sarah's mind raced, remembering the odd comments some of the older neighbors had made over the years, the way certain people still looked at her family during block parties. "But why are you telling me this now?" she asked, her voice steady despite the emotion building in her throat. Richard pulled out another document from the envelope, this one looking more official than the others. "Because last month, while clearing out my father's estate after his passing, I found something that changes everything. Something that suggests your grandmother's purchase of this house was part of something much bigger, a secret network of people working to challenge those housing restrictions across the entire state." The wind howled outside as Sarah processed this information. Her grandmother, her quiet, gentle grandmother who taught her to garden and bake cookies, had been part of an underground movement. The thought seemed impossible, yet somehow perfect at the same time. "There's more," Richard said, hesitating as he touched another paper in the envelope. "My father kept detailed records of everyone involved in this network. Names, dates, locations, all the evidence that could have destroyed dozens of lives if it had fallen into the wrong hands. And according to his notes, your grandmother wasn't just a participant. She was one of its leaders." Sarah's hand trembled as she reached for the envelope, but Richard pulled it back slightly. "Before I show you the rest," he said, his expression grave, "you need to understand something. These documents don't just tell your grandmother's story. They reveal connections to some of the most prominent families in this town, connections that some people might still want to keep buried." Thunder boomed overhead, making them both jump. Sarah glanced at the window, watching rivulets of rain trace patterns on the glass. Her grandmother had passed away 5 years ago, taking what Sarah had thought were simple memories of a quiet life with her. Now, sitting in the same living room where she'd spent countless afternoons listening to Rose's stories about her flower garden, Sarah realized she might not have known her grandmother at all. Richard's fingers moved toward the remaining documents with deliberate slowness. Outside, a tree branch scraped against the window, making an eerie sound that seemed to match the tension in the room. Sarah wrapped her hands around her cooling tea mug, trying to ground herself as her world tilted on its axis. "Before I show you these last papers," Richard said, his voice heavy with the weight of decades, "there's something else you should know. My father didn't just help your grandmother buy this house. He left me a letter explaining why he chose to risk everything to help her. You see, 20 years before your grandmother moved here, this house belonged to my father's best friend, a man who'd saved his life during World War II. Sarah's eyes widened as Richard continued. "That man was your grandfather, Thomas. He and my father served together, but when Thomas returned home, he couldn't buy a house in this neighborhood because of the color of his skin. He died before he could see his dream of living here come true. When your grandmother walked into my father's office that day in 1963, he recognized her last name immediately." A loud crack of thunder made them both jump. Sarah's hands trembled as she processed this revelation. Her grandmother had never talked much about her grandfather, who died before Sarah was born. Now, pieces of a puzzle she hadn't even known existed were starting to fall into place. "My father kept a journal," Richard said, pulling out a leather-bound notebook. "It details everything: the secret meetings, the threats they received, the network of people who worked together to challenge the housing laws. But there's one entry, dated just a week before your grandmother moved in, that changes everything." His hand shook as he opened the journal to a marked page. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. Sarah quickly found her phone and turned on its flashlight. In the harsh beam, Richard's face looked haunted as he stared at the journal's pages. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the room in stark bursts that made the shadows dance on the walls. "According to this entry," Richard continued, his voice barely audible above the storm, There was someone else involved, someone who worked at City Hall and had access to property records. They were secretly changing documents, helping people like your grandmother secure their homes legally. But they were discovered. He paused, swallowing hard. The night before that person was supposed to testify about the corruption in the housing system, they disappeared. They were never found. Sarah's heart pounded as she remembered something. A box in her attic, one her grandmother had made her promise never to open unless something happened to her. "Wait here," she whispered, standing up so quickly she almost knocked over her tea. With shaking hands, she aimed her phone's light toward the attic stairs. As she climbed, the old wooden steps creaking beneath her feet, Sarah could hear Richard moving downstairs. The wind howled through the eaves of the house, as if the storm itself was trying to tell her something. In the attic, dust motes danced in her flashlight beam as she made her way to the corner where she knew the box waited. But when she reached the spot, her blood ran cold. The box was there, but it had already been opened. Papers were scattered around it, and on top lay a single photograph she'd never seen before, one showing her grandmother standing with a group of people, including Richard's father. On the back was written a single line in her grandmother's handwriting: "If you're reading this, they finally found us." Just then, she heard a sharp intake of breath behind her. Sarah whirled around, her flashlight beam catching movement in the attic doorway. Someone was there, watching her, and it wasn't Richard. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as the beam of her flashlight revealed a woman in her 60s, her silver hair gleaming in the darkness. The woman's face was kind but serious, and somehow familiar. "I was wondering when someone would finally find those papers," she said softly, stepping into the attic. "I'm Linda Bennett, and I worked as a clerk at City Hall back in 1963. Downstairs, Sarah could hear Richard calling her name, his footsteps approaching the attic stairs. The woman, Linda, quickly pressed a finger to her lips. "Before he comes up here, you need to know something. Richard isn't telling you the whole truth. His father didn't just help your grandmother. He was protecting her from someone far more dangerous." Thunder rolled overhead as Linda moved closer, pulling an old badge from her pocket. "I didn't disappear that night," she whispered urgently. "Your grandmother helped me fake my own death because someone at City Hall discovered what we were doing. Someone who had everything to lose if the truth came out about the housing discrimination." Sarah heard Richard's footsteps on the attic stairs. Linda quickly pressed a small key into Sarah's palm. "Your grandmother gave me this 40 years ago, told me to keep it safe until the right moment. There's a safety deposit box at First National Bank. Everything you need to know is there, including the name of the person who's been watching this house for the past week." The attic door creaked open wider as Richard appeared, his own phone light sweeping the space. When it landed on Linda, he stumbled backward, the color draining from his face. "You're supposed to be dead," he gasped. "My father said you died that night." Linda's expression hardened. "Your father said a lot of things, Richard, but did you ever ask him about his brother, the one who worked for the housing authority?" She turned to Sarah, her voice urgent. "Your grandmother didn't just buy this house. She uncovered a conspiracy that went all the way to the state level. Property records were being falsified, but not to help people, to steal homes from families who had already bought them legally." Sarah's mind raced as she remembered the strange car she'd seen parked across the streets several times this week. "The person watching the house," she began, but Linda cut her off with a sharp look. The storm outside seemed to pause for a moment, as if holding its breath. "Richard," Linda said carefully, "show her what's really in that envelope you brought. The real reason you came here tonight." Her voice was steady, but her hands were trembling. "Tell her about the lawsuit that's about to be filed against your uncle's estate." Richard's face crumpled as he sank onto an old trunk. "I was trying to warn you," he whispered, pulling out another document from inside his jacket, not the envelope he'd shown downstairs. "They're coming after all the properties, not just this one. They found the original documents, the ones that prove everything. And Sarah," he paused, looking up at her with tears in his eyes, "your grandmother left behind evidence that could expose everyone involved. That's why they sent me here tonight, to find it before you did." A car door slammed outside, barely audible over the storm. Linda rushed to the small attic window and peered out into the darkness. Her sharp intake of breath made Sarah's blood run cold. "They're here," Linda whispered, "and this time they're not just looking for documents." The house groaned in the wind as footsteps echoed on the front porch below. Sarah clutched the key Linda had given her, her grandmother's last secret burning in her palm. The truth about her family's legacy and the corruption that had haunted this neighborhood for decades was finally about to come to light. But first, they had to survive the next few minutes. Lightning flashed again, and in that brief, brilliant moment, Sarah saw shadows moving past the first-floor windows. Someone was trying to get in, and the storm wasn't going to be enough to keep them out much longer. The sound of breaking glass downstairs shattered the tense silence. Linda moved with surprising agility for her age, pulling Sarah and Richard behind a stack of old furniture. "There's another way out," she whispered. "Your grandmother designed it herself, a secret passage to the garage through the old laundry chute. She never trusted that they'd leave her alone." Richard pulled out his phone, his hands shaking. "I can call them off," he said. "Tell them there's nothing here." But Linda grabbed his wrist before he could dial. "Your uncle's people aren't the only ones coming," she said. "I made a call of my own before I came here tonight. The FBI has been building a case for years, gathering evidence about the housing fraud. They're on their way, but we need to protect those documents until they arrive." Heavy footsteps echoed through the house below as Sarah led them to the old laundry chute hidden behind a dusty wardrobe. She'd always thought it was sealed shut, but now she noticed the subtle hinges on one side. Her grandmother had never done anything without a purpose, she realized. Even keeping all those old furniture pieces in the attic had been strategic. Just as they were about to open the chute, Sarah froze. "Wait," she whispered. "The box. We can't leave it." Before anyone could stop her, she darted back to grab the scattered papers and the photograph. As she turned to run back, a flashlight beam cut through the darkness of the attic. A deep voice called out, "They're up here." What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Linda pushed a hidden lever, and the laundry chute door swung open to reveal a narrow passage. Richard, his face a mask of conflict, made a decision. He stepped into the path of the flashlight beam. "Uncle George," he called out. "It's just me up here." Sarah already left through the back door with everything. Sarah felt Linda pulling her into the passage as Richard's voice provided cover. The last thing she saw was Richard holding up his hands to the shadowy figures now filling the attic doorway. "I tried to stop her," she heard him say. "But you need to know something. I already sent copies of everything to the press." The passage was tight but navigable, clearly designed for exactly this purpose. As they shimmied down, Sarah could hear shouting and commotion above. Then suddenly, new voices joined the chaos. Authoritative voices announcing FBI. The sound of running footsteps and what might have been handcuffs clicking closed echoed through the walls. They emerged into the garage just as red and blue lights began flooding the street outside. Linda quickly pulled Sarah behind her car. "Your grandmother knew this day would come," she said, catching her breath. "That's why she left everything in place. The documents, the passage, even me. She needed someone who could testify about what really happened." As FBI agents swarmed the house, Sarah watched Richard being led out in handcuffs alongside 3 other men, but he was smiling. Near the front door, she saw him talking to one of the agents, who was nodding and taking notes. He played both sides, she realized, but in the end, he'd chosen the right one. Linda squeezed her hand and pulled out one final envelope from her jacket. "Your grandmother left you something else," she said. "The deed to not just this house, but 3 others in the neighborhood, houses that her secret network helped other families buy. She wanted you to continue her work, helping families who need a home and a chance." As the storm finally began to fade, Sarah opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a letter in her grandmother's handwriting. "My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, you discovered that sometimes the greatest acts of courage aren't the ones that make headlines. They're the small choices we make every day to help others, even when it's dangerous, even when it's hard. The houses are yours now. Use them wisely, and remember, storms don't last forever, but the foundations we build for others can last for generations." Watching the FBI lead away the last of the men who had tried to bury her grandmother's legacy, Sarah felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. The storm had passed, both literally and figuratively, revealing a truth that had waited decades to come to light. Her simple act of kindness during a storm had uncovered not just a secret, but a legacy of courage, compassion, and justice that would continue to ripple outward for generations to come. Linda smiled, looking up at the clearing sky. "Your grandmother would be proud," she said softly. "You opened your door to a stranger tonight, just like she taught you. And in doing so, you helped unlock the truth she fought so hard to protect." In the days that followed, Sarah learned the full story through Linda and the FBI investigation. Her grandmother hadn't just been fighting for her own home. She'd been part of a network that helped dozens of families secure their pieces of the American dream. The safety deposit box contained detailed records of every family helped, every obstacle overcome, and every small victory won in the fight for fair housing. Richard's role turned out to be more complex than anyone had imagined. He'd spent years gathering evidence against his uncle's corrupt housing scheme while maintaining his cover. His appearance at Sarah's door that stormy night hadn't been a coincidence. He'd chosen that moment because he knew his uncle's men were closing in, and he needed to ensure Sarah and the documents were protected. The FBI investigation revealed that the corruption went deeper than anyone had suspected. Several prominent city officials from that era were implicated in the housing fraud scheme, and the evidence Sarah's grandmother had preserved proved crucial in bringing them to justice. The story made national headlines, not just for the exposed corruption, but for the courage of those who had fought against it in silence for so many years. Linda became a regular visitor to the house, helping Sarah sort through the documents and connect with the families her grandmother had helped. Together, they began creating a community foundation, using the 3 houses Sarah had inherited to continue her grandmother's legacy of helping families in need find homes of their own. One sunny afternoon, about a month after the storm, Sarah sat on her front porch with Linda, looking through an old photo album they'd found in the attic. "You know what amazes me most?" Sarah said, touching a photo of her grandmother standing proudly in front of the house. "She never let bitterness take root in her heart. Despite everything she faced, she still taught me to open my door to strangers in need." Linda smiled, her eyes distant with memories. "Your grandmother used to say that change doesn't come from fighting darkness with darkness. It comes from being brave enough to offer light when it's storming outside." She patted Sarah's hand. "That's why she left you these houses. She knew you'd understand that they're not just buildings. They're opportunities to continue that legacy of kindness." Richard, now cleared of any wrongdoing and celebrated as a key witness in the federal case, stopped by occasionally to help with the foundation. The night of the storm had transformed him too, relieving him of the burden he carried for years while working to expose his uncle's crimes. As Sarah stood on her porch that final evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors her grandmother would have loved, she understood something profound. Sometimes the greatest acts of courage aren't dramatic confrontations or bold statements. They're the quiet choices we make when no one is watching. The choice to help a stranger in a storm. The choice to protect the truth even when it's dangerous. The choice to build something that will outlast us. She touched the warm wood of her front door, remembering that rainy night that had changed everything. Her grandmother's house hadn't just been a shelter from storms. It had been a beacon of hope, a symbol of resistance, and now it would be something even more. A continuation of a legacy that had started with one brave woman who dared to dream of a better world. The story of that stormy night would be told many times in the years to come, but its true power lay not in the dramatic revelations or the exposed corruption. It lay in the simple truth that had started it all. The moment when a young woman, taught by her grandmother's example, opened her door to a stranger in need. Because sometimes the greatest stories of courage and change don't begin with grand gestures. They begin with simple acts of kindness, offered freely in the midst of life's storms.